Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the GOP primaries for governor in the state of Maryland between current Secretary of Commerce Kelly Schulz and House of Delegates member Dan Cox. Now this is really the only primary being held in the month of July. The big ones are being held in August and September, namely Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Arizona, and other states like that. So those are really the rest of the primaries we have to look forward to. But right now, this is really the only big primary taking place this month. And it's turning out to be a very competitive and divisive one. So we'll take a look at the two candidates in this race, as well as some of the polling, general election data, and other information to kind of determine which of these candidates would be the strongest nominee in November and which one of these candidates has an edge in this Republican primary. But before we get into it, please consider liking this video down below if you enjoy and subscribing to the channel. So anyway, let's dive straight into it. So currently, according to the polls that we have, which we only have 4, Dan Cox is in the lead in the majority of these polls. However, there's a large amount of undecided voters, 45, 42%, 68%. Now, we really don't know if we're going to get another poll before the primaries on Tuesday. Hopefully we do, to kind of get a better sense of where this race is headed. But so far, Dan Cox, who is the Trump-endorsed candidate in this race, is in the lead. The latest poll has him up 3 points on Kelly Schulz, but the poll before that has Kelly Schulz up by 6. So again, these are really small sample sizes, and it's very hard to say who's actually in the lead right now. But this has turned into a pretty bitter proxy war between former President Donald Trump and current Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, who ideologically have been kind of sparring for a number of years. Larry Hogan is a representative of the more moderate wing of the Republican Party, the anti-Trump wing, effectively, of the Republican Party, which is really a dying breed of the Republican Party. And of course, you have Donald Trump, who is a representative of the America First wing of the Republican Party, the ultra-conservative wing. So Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland is a very popular governor, and depending on which polls you look at, his approval rating sits at either the mid-60s or the low 70s. But the vast majority of that approval comes from Democrats and independents, not Republican voters. So despite Larry Hogan being a Republican governor of a very blue state, the Republicans in the state aren't really behind him. Granted, he did win by a pretty large margin back in 2018, but that was really before he came out in support of Donald Trump's impeachment, and of course before COVID. So at this point in his governorship, he was much more popular among base Republicans, although he still kind of had a reputation of being a more moderate Republican as compared to the National Party. So his pick for governor, Kelly Schulz, has an incredible edge in the general election. If we take a look at this Newsweek article, which kind of dives into both Dan Cox and Kelly Schulz, there is a question that they asked Democrats while polling around the state of what they thought of the nominees and whether they consider voting for Schulz and Dan Cox in the general election. And if we take a look at the results of those polls, Dan Cox, 84% of Democrats said they wouldn't even consider voting for Dan Cox in a general election. Compared to Kelly Schulz, just 49% of Democrats say they wouldn't even consider her. That's a gigantic difference in candidate quality in this race. Dan Cox really only appeals to base Republican voters and, kind of those voters that care about these hot button conservative issues in the primaries, not so much in the general election. Only about 9% of Democrats said they would actually consider backing him if he was the Republican nominee, compared to 23% of Democrats, with 11% of Democrats saying it depends. So really, if you want to put that together, about a third of Democrats would consider voting for Kelly Schulz, whereas only 9% would consider voting for Dan Cox. And that's one of the reasons why the Democratic Governors Association has put about $1 million or so airing ads for Dan Cox around the state of Maryland, tying him to Donald Trump, saying that he is Trump's pick, and kind of trying to frame it as a way to trick Republican voters in the primary into voting for somebody that is totally unelectable in the general election. We saw this in a number of other states. They tried to do this in the state of Colorado. It ultimately failed. And we saw it successfully done in the state of Illinois, where the Republicans nominated Darren Bailey, who is, for all intents and purposes, an unelectable candidate, even in a red wave year in Illinois. And they're trying to do this in Maryland because they know that Kelly Schulz, who basically on policy is basically the same as Larry Hogan, she's in the Hogan administration, she's much more electable in a general election, and they want to get the state of Maryland off their radar as states they have to put money into, because if Kelly Schultz is the Republican nominee, Democrats are actually going to have to fight for this seat in the governorship. Again, depending on who the Democratic nominee is, Peter Franco, who is the comptroller, has a reputation of being a much more moderate Democrat, mainly on economic issues, and that's really the appeal of the Hogan Republicans, the Kelly Schultzes, is that they're moderate on economics, they're business friendly, and that actually plays very well in the state of Maryland. Maryland would rather vote for a business friendly Republican as governor than a progressive Democrat, and that's one of the reasons why 2018 was such a landslide against Ben Jealous, who was a very far left candidate in the state of Maryland, and Larry Hogan was the moderate in this race, and ultimately he ended up winning by a safe margin despite many other states to the right of Maryland electing Democratic governors. So as of right now in the primary, Trump obviously has been doing a lot to support Dan Cox. He's been going out on Truth Social, bashing Larry Hogan as a rhino and Kelly Schultz as a rhino, and really trying to prop up his candidate. Now, Trump is very popular among Maryland Republicans, so much so that in a head-to-head matchup, a hypothetical matchup between Larry Hogan and Donald Trump in a 2024 presidential primary, Larry Hogan gets just a third of Republican support in a primary matchup between Donald Trump. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Kelly Schultz would fare as poorly against a Trump-endorsed candidate, but it still speaks volumes to the fact that Donald Trump is much more popular in the state of Maryland than its current Republican governor among the GOP base, which, I mean, in a Republican primary is really all that matters. So Kelly Schultz has a lot of work to do in the next couple of days, and really she doesn't have a whole lot of time to try and paint herself as the electable candidate. She's been trying to do this. She's been trying to appeal to more moderate suburban Republican voters that she's going to need to win the general election. But her toughest battle is getting through the primary. I'd say she'd have a much easier time in the general election than somebody like Dan Cox, who at the most I could see getting maybe 37-38% of the vote in Maryland. And I think that's a bit of a stretch. He's probably likely to get only 35-36%, even in a red wave year, since he is so far to the right compared to where Maryland general election voters are. Now, Kelly Schultz, on the other hand, would easily get in the mid to high 40s in a good year for Republicans, and if she is able to run a successful campaign against whoever the Democratic nominee is. But strictly speaking, in the primary, I think her strengths are mainly going to be in these moderate to liberal areas where the Republicans tend to be more moderate to liberal, mainly the Baltimore metro area and the DC metro area. Dan Cox is going to be very popular in Western Maryland and potentially the Eastern Shore as well, although I wouldn't be surprised if areas of the Eastern Shore actually do come out for Schultz as well, although I could see Cox doing very well here at the same time, because he is the much more conservative candidate in this primary, and the Eastern Shore in general and Western Maryland are by far the most conservative parts of the state of Maryland. I mean, Western Maryland arguably has a lot more in common with the South than the Mid-Atlantic when it comes to voting patterns and, of course, cultural views. So that's really going to be the strengths of Dan Cox. The good thing for him is that these areas are the biggest areas in GOP primaries. Obviously, these super blue counties around the DC metro area don't have a lot of Republican voters, to say the least, and that's going to hurt Kelly Schultz because her support is going to come from these more moderate areas. You know, Frederick, I think she is from Frederick, so that could help her because that's more of a Western Maryland county that has in recent years trended very far to the left. Of course, it voted 9 points in favor of Joe Biden back in 2020. Anne Arundel County was another historically Republican county that has lurched dramatically to the left to the point where Biden won it by a safe margin. You know, this was a county that McCain and Romney won back in 2008 and 2012. So ultimately, these are going to be areas where Kelly Schultz will probably perform better, but Dan Cox is going to run up the margins in these other parts of the state, these redder rural parts of the state. But it is hard to say which of these candidates has the edge right now. My gut instinct says that Dan Cox has the edge, considering that Trump has been doing a lot more to support him on Truth Social and other platforms where a lot of Trump supporters and Republicans reside on, so that message might resonate with the base. But Kelly Schultz also has a lot of money at hand. She has the most money raised, and even though Dan Cox is getting a lot of money from the Democratic Governors Association, perhaps Kelly Schultz is able to get that viewpoint to penetrate to the wider base to indicate that Dan Cox is being propped up by the Democrats as a surefire bet to lose. But that didn't really work in states like Illinois. And, you know, in a state like Maryland, where the Maryland Republican Party is actually pretty right-wing compared to other blue state Republican parties like Vermont and Massachusetts. So ultimately, I think Dan Cox probably does have the edge in this primary. He does have the grassroots support. Kelly Schultz has obviously the national support from Republican groups and obviously Maryland Republican groups that want to see a candidate that can actually win in the general election. Dan Cox has led in the majority of polls, but again, these polls have had large amounts of undecided voters. And this Remington Research poll, which you know, is a Cox internal, has him at 76%. That's a garbage poll. That's not going to happen at all. But I wouldn't be surprised if Cox is able to pull this out just based alone on Trump support. And ultimately, he would end up losing by a colossal margin in November. Kelly Schultz really is the only electable Republican in this primary, but ultimately her ties to Larry Hogan and, you know, Hogan's criticism of Trump have really unearthed the wrath of Donald Trump in this primary, because we all know that Donald Trump endorses the candidates who are going to be the most supportive of him, regardless of how unelectable they are. Trump likes to pick winners in elections, but ultimately I think he gets blindsided by his own ego and by candidates who he thinks are going to do the best to represent him in Washington. Whether or not they can win or not is a totally different argument. So anyway, guys, that's it for today's video. Please like this video down below if you enjoyed and subscribe to the channel if you are new. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.